Flashing red and blue lights cut through the heavy midnight rain, reflecting off the polished hood of a Mercedes. Inside sits a man who has spent 30 years sending criminals to prison, completely unaware that tonight he is the one about to be thrown in handcuffs. A routine traffic stop is about to spiral into a viral nightmare of abuse, arrogance, and a shocking twist that will shatter a corrupt police department. Stay tuned, because arrogance is blinding. The courthouse was practically a tomb by the time Honorable Harrison Caldwell finally packed up his briefcase. At 58, Harrison was a man who commanded the room before he even opened his mouth. A distinguished black man with silver threading through his close-cropped hair, his posture was a testament to decades of bearing the immense weight of the law. He was a Superior Court judge in the district, a man who had clawed his way up from a working-class neighborhood to the highest echelons of the state's judicial system. Tonight, his bones ached with the specific kind of exhaustion that came from presiding over a grueling 3-week homicide trial. He locked his chambers, the heavy oak door clicking shut with a finality that echoed down the marble hallways. Under his arm, tucked neatly inside a black, waterproof garment bag, was his judicial robe. It was his armor, a symbol of the heavy responsibility he wielded, and he was taking it home to be professionally dry-cleaned for the upcoming swearing-in ceremony of new attorneys the following week. Outside, the sky had opened up, dumping a relentless sheet of freezing rain onto the city streets. Harrison hurried to his reserved parking spot, slipping into the heated, leather-bound sanctuary of his dark blue Mercedes-Benz S-Class. The engine purred to life, a quiet, expensive hum that barely registered over the sound of the rain drumming against the windshield. His commute home to Oak Ridge Estates, a secluded, affluent suburb known for its manicured lawns, sprawling mansions, and heavy private security presence, was usually his time to decompress. The roads were slick, shining like black glass under the amber glow of the streetlights. Harrison drove meticulously, his hands resting easily at 10 and 2, the classical music station playing softly from the vehicle's surround sound speakers. He was less than 2 miles from his driveway when the darkness behind him was violently shattered. The strobe of red and blue lights exploded in his rearview mirror, blindingly bright. A police siren gave a short, aggressive wail, a demand, not a request. Harrison's brow furrowed. He glanced at his speedometer. 35 in a 35 zone. Both headlights were functioning. His tags were current, renewed just 3 weeks prior. A flicker of unease danced in his chest, a primal instinct that not even a Harvard law degree and a seat on the bench could fully eradicate. He knew the statistics. He knew the reality of the streets, often better than the officers patrolling them. Remaining perfectly calm, Harrison activated his right turn signal, slowly pulling the Mercedes onto the shoulder of the road, stopping beneath the dim illumination of a flickering street lamp. He shifted the car into park, turned off the engine, and rolled down all 4 windows, a standard precaution to ensure officers felt safe approaching the vehicle. He placed his large, steady hands firmly on the top of the steering wheel, where they were clearly visible. Through the rain-streaked side mirror, he watched the cruiser's door open. 2 figures stepped out into the deluge. The lead officer, walking with a puffed-out chest and a swagger that bordered on theatrical, was Officer Mitchell Reynolds. Reynolds was in his late 20s, a man whose aggressive posture suggested a deep-seated need to prove his authority. His hand hovered over the butt of his service weapon as he approached the driver's side. Trailing slightly behind him on the passenger side was his younger partner, Officer Tyler Jenkins, a rookie who looked like he barely needed to shave, his face tight with nervous energy. Reynolds flashed his heavy maglite directly into Harrison's face, the beam searing his retinas. "Good evening, officer," Harrison said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone, projecting the same authoritative calm he used to silence bickering attorneys in his courtroom. "Is there a problem?" "Keep your hands on the wheel," Reynolds barked, completely ignoring the greeting. The flashlight beam aggressively swept the luxurious interior of the Mercedes, lingering on the wood-grain dashboard, the premium leather, and finally settling back on Harrison's face. "Whose car is this?" Harrison blinked against the harsh light. "Whose car is this?" The underlying accusation in the question was immediate and crystal clear. "This is my vehicle, officer," Harrison replied evenly. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" Reynolds scoffed, a wet, ugly sound that cut through the rain. "Your vehicle? Right. You expect me to believe a guy like you is cruising around Oak Ridge Estates in a $150,000 Benz at 1 in the morning?" Harrison felt a cold, familiar knot tighten in his stomach. It was the same prejudiced venom he had fought against his entire career, manifesting right here on a dark road. He knew instantly that his judicial title would not save him. In fact, revealing it now to a man looking for a fight might only escalate the situation. Reynolds wasn't looking for a judge. He was looking for a victim. "I live in this neighborhood," Harrison stated clearly. "I am returning home from work. Again, officer, I am legally required to ask, what is your reasonable suspicion for initiating this traffic stop?" The legal terminology seemed to act like a spark on a powder keg. Reynolds leaned closer, his face inches from the window, rain dripping from the brim of his cap. He smelled faintly of stale coffee and overpowering spearmint gum. "Oh, we got a roadside lawyer here," Reynolds sneered, glancing over the roof of the car at his partner. "Hey, Tyler, you hear this guy? Asking about reasonable suspicion." Reynolds turned his attention back to Harrison, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "I'll tell you what my suspicion is. My suspicion is that this car doesn't belong to you. My suspicion is that you're going to hand me your license, registration, and proof of insurance, or I'm going to drag you out through this window. Understand?" Harrison did not flinch. He slowly lifted his right hand, keeping his movements deliberate and telegraphed. "My wallet is in my breast pocket, officer. My registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for my wallet now." "Do it slow!" Reynolds snapped, his hand gripping the handle of his gun tightly. Harrison retrieved his wallet, extracting his driver's license, and then reached across to pop the glove compartment, handing over the registration. He kept his hands entirely visible the whole time. Reynolds snatched the documents. He shined his light on the license. Harrison Caldwell. He looked at the registration. Harrison Caldwell. The paperwork was flawless, but instead of returning the documents and sending him on his way, Reynolds's jaw set in a stubborn, angry line. The facts did not align with the narrative he had already written in his head. "Fake ID," Reynolds muttered confidently, tapping the plastic card against his knuckles. "Good quality, but I've seen better. Where do you steal the car, Caldwell? Or whatever your real name is?" "Officer, that is a state-issued driver's license. The vehicle is registered to me," Harrison said, his tone dropping an octave, slipping into the cold, commanding register that usually made seasoned defense attorneys break into a sweat. "I have complied with your requests. If you are not writing me a citation for a traffic violation, I am asking if I am free to go." "You're not going anywhere," Reynolds spat. "Step out of the vehicle." "I am politely declining your request to step out of the vehicle, officer, as you have not articulated a lawful reason for detaining me," Harrison replied, his hands remaining locked on the steering wheel. He knew the law perfectly. Pennsylvania versus Mims gave officers the right to order a driver out of a car, but Harrison was testing the waters, documenting every constitutional violation in his mental ledger. He wanted Reynolds to commit fully to his baseless aggression. "It wasn't a request, pal," Reynolds shouted, suddenly yanking the driver's side door open. The freezing rain immediately blew into the pristine interior of the Mercedes. "Step out of the car right now, or I will charge you with resisting arrest." From the passenger side, Officer Jenkins shifted uncomfortably, his flashlight wavering. "Mitch!" Jenkins called out hesitantly over the rain. "The registration matches the ID. Maybe we should just run it through dispatch before we—" "Shut up, Tyler," Reynolds barked. "I know a booster when I see one." "He's stalling." Reynolds turned back to Harrison, his hand now hovering over his taser. "Last warning, Caldwell. Out of the car." Harrison unbuckled his seatbelt with slow, precise movements. He knew that arguing constitutional law on the side of a dark highway with an armed, irrational man was a fool's errand. The courtroom was his battlefield, not the asphalt. He stepped out into the freezing rain, standing to his full height. At 6'2", he towered over Officer Reynolds, a physical reality that only seemed to infuriate the young cop further. "Turn around and put your hands on the roof of the car," Reynolds ordered, shoving Harrison roughly by the shoulder. Harrison remained stoic, absorbing the physical insult without a word, placing his hands flat against the cold, wet roof of his own vehicle. He spread his legs as Reynolds kicked his ankles apart, aggressively patting down the pockets of Harrison's tailored suit jacket and trousers. "Nothing on him," Reynolds grunted. He leaned into the open doorway of the Mercedes, his flashlight sweeping the interior again. The beam moved from the empty passenger seat to the back seat, finally illuminating the black garment bag hanging from the dry-cleaning hook. The zipper had slipped down a few inches, revealing the heavy, pleated black fabric inside. Reynolds grabbed the bag and unceremoniously yanked it off the hook, tossing it onto the wet leather of the back seat. He ripped the zipper all the way down, exposing the black judicial robe. A cruel, mocking laugh erupted from Reynolds's chest. "Well, look what we have here, Tyler." Reynolds pulled the heavy black robe out of the protective bag, holding it up in the rain. The fabric, meant to represent impartial justice, dripped with dirty highway water. "What is this?" Reynolds sneered, walking over to where Harrison stood with his hands on the roof. He shoved the wet fabric into Harrison's line of sight. "Is this a choir gown? You singing in the gospel choir on Sundays, stealing cars on Fridays?" "That is a judicial robe," Harrison said, his voice eerily calm, despite the inferno of rage building in his chest at seeing his symbol of office disrespected. "Please return it to the protective bag." Reynolds burst into raucous laughter, looking over at his partner. Jenkins didn't laugh. He just looked deeply uncomfortable, rain plastered to his pale face. "A judicial robe," Reynolds mocked, stepping closer to Harrison, his breath hot against the judge's neck. "Who are you dressing up as, Grandpa? Judge Judy? Is it Halloween already? Or are you playing a lawyer in some community theater play?" "I am not playing anything, officer," Harrison replied, keeping his eyes fixed on the wet asphalt. "I strongly advise you to run my name through your dispatch system. Look at the occupation listed in the state registry." "I don't need dispatch to tell me what I'm looking at," Reynolds spat, tossing the wet robe onto the muddy shoulder of the road. Harrison's jaw tightened so hard his teeth ached as the fabric hit the dirt. "I'm looking at a liar, a thief, and a guy who thinks he's smarter than the police. Let me guess, you broke into some rich guy's house in Oak Ridge, stole the keys to the Benz, and grabbed this costume to use as a disguise? Or maybe you were going to pawn it." "You're making a grave mistake," Harrison said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet whisper. "A mistake that will cost you your badge." That was the trigger. Reynolds's face contorted with pure, unadulterated rage. The idea of this man, a black man he had already categorized as a criminal, threatening his authority was intolerable. "Are you threatening me?" Reynolds screamed, grabbing Harrison by the collar of his expensive suit and violently slamming him against the side of the Mercedes. The impact knocked the wind out of Harrison, his chest hitting the doorframe hard. "Mitch, hey, take it easy!" Jenkins yelled, finally taking a step forward, his hands raised. "He's not fighting back. Just cuff him if we're taking him. He just threatened an officer of the law." Reynolds roared, pressing his forearm against the back of Harrison's neck, pinning his face to the wet glass of the window. "Give me your hands. Stop resisting." "I am not resisting," Harrison gasped out, his cheek flattened against the glass. He brought his hands behind his back entirely of his own volition, refusing to give Reynolds the satisfaction of a struggle. He knew that any sudden movement, any attempt to defend himself, would be written up in a falsified police report as assaulting an officer. Click, click. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit brutally into Harrison's wrists. Reynolds ratcheted them as tight as they could possibly go, cutting off the circulation to Harrison's hands instantly. The indignity of the moment was suffocating. Honorable Harrison Caldwell, a man who had sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution, a man who regularly had the chief of police sitting in his chambers asking for warrants, was now shackled like a violent felon in the pouring rain, pinned against his own property. "You're under arrest for grand theft auto, possession of stolen property, and resisting arrest," Reynolds hissed in Harrison's ear, his tone triumphant. "You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it, because I am sick of hearing your voice." As Reynolds dragged Harrison backward toward the police cruiser, a pair of headlights approached from the opposite direction, slowing down. It was a silver Lexus SUV. Harrison recognized the vehicle instantly. It belonged to Richard Farnsworth, a retired orthopedic surgeon who lived 3 houses down from Harrison in Oak Ridge Estates. The SUV rolled to a near stop. Richard Farnsworth peered through the rain-streaked window, his eyes locking onto Harrison. Harrison looked back at his neighbor, rain dripping from his eyelashes, his hands bound tightly behind his back. He expected Richard to roll down the window, to yell out to the officers, "Hey, what are you doing? That's Judge Caldwell." Instead, Richard Farnsworth's eyes widened in shock, and then, slowly, a look of nervous apprehension washed over his face. He quickly looked away, hitting the gas and speeding past the scene, his taillights disappearing into the stormy night. The betrayal stung, but it only crystallized Harrison's resolve. The world saw what it wanted to see. Reynolds saw a criminal. Farnsworth saw a liability. Neither saw the man. "Keep moving," Reynolds barked, shoving Harrison roughly toward the back of the squad car. Jenkins opened the rear door, looking down at his boots, unable to meet Harrison's eyes. Reynolds grabbed the top of Harrison's head and practically threw him into the cramped, hard plastic back seat of the cruiser. The door slammed shut with a heavy metallic thud, sealing Harrison in the claustrophobic darkness, smelling of vomit and industrial cleaner. Outside, Harrison could hear the muffled voices of the 2 officers through the rain. "Mitch, are you sure about this?" Jenkins was saying, his voice laced with panic. "The car isn't reported stolen. The plates come back to him. We have no actual probable cause. And the guy isn't acting like a booster. What if that ID is real?" "Grow a spine, Tyler," Reynolds snapped back. "I've been on the force 5 years longer than you. I know how these guys operate. They get their hands on a nice suit and a fancy car, and they think they're untouchable. He probably printed that ID in his basement. And what about that weird black costume? Who carries that around? It's probably stolen property too. We'll get him to the precinct, put him in the box, and he'll confess. They always do." "What about his car?" Jenkins asked. "Call for a tow, have it impounded, and toss that stupid dress in the trunk for evidence." Harrison sat in the pitch-black back seat, his wrists throbbing, his wet suit clinging to his skin, shivering violently from the cold. He leaned his head back against the thick plexiglass partition. A normal man would be screaming. A normal man would be crying, begging them to check his credentials, shouting his title until his throat bled. But Harrison was a master chess player, and Officer Reynolds had just aggressively moved his pawns without looking at the board. Harrison knew the dashcam was rolling. He knew the microphones on the officers' uniforms were recording every word, every threat, every racial assumption, masked as police intuition. He also knew the moment he revealed his identity as a superior court judge, the blue wall of silence would descend. Reynolds would immediately apologize, claim it was a terrible misunderstanding, uncuff him, and beg for forgiveness. The department brass would sweep it under the rug, offering Harrison a private apology while leaving Reynolds on the streets to terrorize someone who didn't have the power to destroy him. Harrison wasn't going to let that happen. He wasn't going to let Reynolds realize his mistake in the dark, where it could be hidden. He was going to let him carry this charade all the way into the blinding fluorescent lights of the precinct. He was going to let Reynolds write his falsified report. He was going to let him stand before the booking sergeant and double down on his lies. Only when the trap was completely sprung, only when there was absolutely no way for the department to hide the rot in their ranks, would Honorable Harrison Caldwell finally introduce himself. The front doors of the cruiser opened, and both officers slid into the front seats, bringing the smell of wet wool and adrenaline with them. Reynolds adjusted the rearview mirror, locking eyes with Harrison in the reflection. "Comfortable back there, fake ID?" Reynolds sneered, throwing the cruiser into drive. Harrison Caldwell looked directly into the mirror, his face a mask of terrifying, unbreakable calm. "I am exactly where I need to be, Officer Reynolds," Harrison replied softly. Drive. The 12th precinct of the Oak Ridge Police Department was a stark contrast to the affluent neighborhood it bordered. Inside, it was a sensory assault of harsh fluorescent lighting, peeling linoleum floors, and the deeply ingrained odors of industrial bleach, stale sweat, and burnt coffee. It was a place designed to break spirits, to make the people sitting on the hard wooden benches feel small and powerless. Officer Mitchell Reynolds practically kicked the heavy double doors open, marching Harrison Caldwell into the chaotic bullpen by the chain of his handcuffs. Harrison's tailored suit was thoroughly soaked, sticking to his frame, and his wrists were bruised a deep, angry purple. Yet, he walked with a perfectly straight spine, his chin held high. He did not look like a man who had just been arrested. He looked like a man inspecting a severely mismanaged facility. "Keep walking, Booster," Reynolds muttered, shoving Harrison toward the booking desk. Behind the elevated desk sat Desk Sergeant William Brody. Brody was a 20-year veteran of the force, a large, balding man with heavy bags under his eyes, who looked like he had seen every variation of human stupidity at least twice. He barely looked up from his computer screen as Reynolds approached, dragging Harrison like a hunting trophy. "What do we have tonight, Mitch?" Brody asked, his voice a rumbling monotone, tapping away at his keyboard. "Looks like you dragged this one through the local car wash. Got a live one, Sarge," Reynolds boasted, leaning against the tall desk, chest puffed out. "Grand theft auto, possession of stolen property, resisting arrest, and carrying a highly sophisticated fake ID. Pulled him out of a stolen $150,000 Mercedes S-Class over on Elm and Maple." Brody finally looked up, his weary eyes scanning Harrison from head to toe. He took in the wet, expensive suit, the silver hair, and the unflinching, cold stare. Brody had processed thousands of car thieves in his career. The man standing in front of him didn't fit the profile. Not even slightly. "Fake ID, huh?" Brody said skeptically, extending a meaty hand. "Let's see it." Reynolds slapped Harrison's wallet onto the desk. "Yeah, it scans, but look at him. Guy claims he lives in Oak Ridge Estates. Probably printed the card in a boiler room downtown." Officer Tyler Jenkins walked through the double doors a moment later, carrying the dripping black garment bag and the soaked judicial robe wadded up under his arm. He looked miserable, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "Put the evidence on the counter, Tyler," Reynolds commanded. He pointed a mocking finger at the wet black fabric. "Get a load of this, Sarge. Guy was carrying around a choir gown, or a Halloween costume. Probably stole it out of the trunk of the Benz." Harrison stood perfectly still in front of the desk. He looked directly up at the security camera, mounted in the corner of the ceiling, ensuring his face was clearly visible, before speaking in a booming, perfectly articulated voice that silenced the surrounding officers in the bullpen. "For the record, Harrison stated, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "The time is exactly 1:47 in the morning. I am formally requesting that these handcuffs be loosened. They have been ratcheted to their maximum tightness without justification, cutting off my circulation, and I am beginning to experience numbness and severe nerve pain in both hands." Brody frowned, looking over the desk at Harrison's wrists. The metal was indeed biting viciously into the flesh, the skin around the cuffs swollen and discolored. "Loosen his cuffs, Mitch," Brody ordered softly. "There's no reason to have him strung up like a hog if he's cooperating." "He's not cooperating, Sarge. He threatened me on the side of the road," Reynolds protested, his face flushing red. "He said I was making a mistake and that I was going to lose my badge. That's a direct threat to a police officer. I'm leaving them on until he's in the cage." Harrison did not argue. He simply looked back up at the camera, giving a single slow nod to the lens. The documentation was complete. Reynolds had just admitted, on the precinct's internal audio-visual recording system, to using the handcuffs as a punitive measure for a perceived insult, a direct violation of department policy and a clear-cut case of excessive force. Brody sighed, rubbing his temples. He didn't have the energy to fight with a hothead like Reynolds at 2 in the morning. "Fine. Let's just get him in the system. Empty your pockets, John Doe." "My name is Harrison Caldwell," Harrison replied calmly, "as the identification card currently resting on your desk clearly states." "Yeah, we'll see about that," Brody muttered. He opened the wallet, pulled out the damp driver's license, and began typing the information into his terminal. Reynolds, meanwhile, strutted over to a nearby workstation and logged in to begin his arrest report. He typed furiously, eager to document his heroic takedown of a master car thief. He was already composing the narrative in his head. Suspect exhibited aggressive, furtive movements. Suspect aggressively resisted verbal commands. Suspect issued violent threats against my person. "Hey, Tyler," Reynolds called out across the room, not taking his eyes off his screen. "Make sure you log that black dress into the property room as miscellaneous stolen garments. I want it documented." Jenkins nodded weakly, pulling a plastic evidence bag from a dispenser. As he unfolded the wet black fabric to shove it into the bag, he paused. He held the robe up by the shoulders. It was heavy, pleated, with wide bell sleeves. It didn't look like a choir robe. It looked incredibly formal. Jenkins swallowed hard, a terrible, sinking feeling settling into the pit of his stomach. "All right, Caldwell, or whoever you are," Brody grunted, stepping out from behind the desk and motioning toward the live-scan fingerprint machine. "Step over here. Put your right thumb on the glass." Harrison stepped forward. Despite the agonizing pain in his wrists, he managed to contort his hands to press his right thumb onto the illuminated green glass of the scanner. He did not say a word. He followed every instruction with mechanical precision. Right thumb, right index. Left thumb, left index. 4 fingers flat. Brody watched the screen as the digital prints populated. The Automated Fingerprint Identification System, AFIS, linked directly to the FBI's National Crime Information Center, NCIC, and the state's secure judicial and law enforcement databases. It was designed to catch aliases, outstanding warrants, and reveal the true identity of anyone processed. "Systems running," Brody announced lazily, taking a sip from a styrofoam cup of cold coffee. "Should take about 30 seconds. Then we'll see what kind of sheet you actually have, buddy." Reynolds chuckled from his workstation. "Bet you at 20 it comes back to a rap sheet a mile long, Sarge. Grand theft, burglary, the works." Harrison simply stared at Brody. Brody glanced at the screen. The loading bar reached 100%. The system chimed softly. Brody blinked. He leaned closer to the monitor, his brow furrowing deeply. He rubbed his eyes and looked again. The text on the screen was glowing in a bright, undeniable green font. AFIS/N. CIC database match. Result. Category data record name, Caldwell, Harrison T.D. O.B., August 14th, 1967. Criminal history, 0 results. Clean record. Employment status, state government official. Clearance level, Judicial Tier 1, high security. Title, Superior Court Judge, 5th District. Alert. Verified official, do not detain without warrant. Brody's mouth opened, but no sound came out. All the blood instantly drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, chalky white. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He slowly looked up from the monitor. He looked at the tall, silver-haired black man standing in front of him, soaking wet, shivering, with his hands clamped in brutally tight metal cuffs behind his back. He then looked past Harrison, toward the counter where Officer Jenkins was attempting to stuff the wet black garment into an evidence bag. Brody's eyes locked onto the garment. The heavy pleats, the bell sleeves, a choir gown, a Halloween costume. Brody felt physically ill. It wasn't a costume, it was a judicial robe, a superior court judge's robe. "Sarge," Jenkins stammered, noticing the sheer horror radiating from Brody's face. "What is it? Did he pop for a warrant?" "Oh my God," Brody whispered, the sound barely escaping his lips. His hands started to shake violently. He had been on the force for 2 decades. He knew the names of the judges. He knew the name Caldwell. He had just never seen the man in person, let alone drenched in rain without his suit jacket and tie on. "Mitch," Brody said, his voice cracking. "Mitch, stop typing." Reynolds, oblivious to the nuclear bomb that had just detonated in the room, kept hammering away at his keyboard. "Just finishing the narrative, Sarge. I'm hitting him with the resisting charge, too. Guy's a menace." "Mitchell, get your hands off that damn keyboard right now!" Brody roared, the sudden explosion of volume making every officer in the bullpen jump out of their skin. Reynolds froze, his hands hovering over the keys, blinking in confusion. "What? Sarge, what's the problem?" Brody didn't answer him. He practically dove over the booking desk, fumbling frantically for his heavy ring of keys. He rushed toward Harrison, his hands shaking so badly he dropped the keys twice onto the linoleum floor. "Your Honor," Brody choked out, his voice trembling with sheer panic as he scooped up the keys and grabbed Harrison's arm. "Your Honor, sir, I am so sorry. I am so deeply, deeply sorry." Reynolds stood up from his desk, a mocking smile still plastered on his face. "Your Honor? Sarge, what kind of joke is this? Did the fake ID say he was the mayor or something?" "Shut your mouth, Reynolds! Not another word!" Brody screamed over his shoulder as he desperately jammed the small key into the cuffs binding Harrison's wrists. Click, click, the heavy metal cuffs fell away. Harrison brought his arms forward slowly, wincing in visible pain as the blood rushed back into his severely bruised and indented wrists. He rubbed them gently, his face remaining entirely impassive. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply stood there, a towering pillar of silent, terrifying authority. "What is going on here?" The booming voice came from the staircase leading to the upper offices. Captain Leonard Hayes, the night shift commander, stood on the landing, holding a mug of tea. Hayes was a sharp, meticulous man who ran a tight ship. He descended the stairs, his eyes darting between Brody's panicked face, Reynolds's confusion, and the wet, bruised man standing in the center of the room. As Hayes got closer, his eyes widened. He stopped dead in his tracks, dropping his ceramic mug. It shattered on the floor, hot tea splashing everywhere. But Hayes didn't even flinch. Captain Hayes knew exactly who Harrison Caldwell was. Just 3 weeks ago, Hayes had sat in the witness box in Caldwell's courtroom, testifying in a high-profile homicide case. He knew the judge's face, his voice, and his fearsome reputation for zero tolerance when it came to police misconduct. "Judge Caldwell," Captain Hayes breathed, his voice hollow with disbelief. He looked at the bruised wrists. He looked at the puddles of water forming around Harrison's expensive shoes. He looked at the judicial robe stuffed halfway into a plastic evidence bag. The entire precinct went dead silent. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights and the rain lashing against the barred windows. Officer Mitchell Reynolds' arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a look of profound, paralyzing confusion, which slowly, agonizingly morphed into absolute terror. "Captain Hayes," Harrison finally spoke. His voice was no longer the polite, restrained tone he had used on the side of the highway. It was the voice of the court. It was a voice that commanded absolute silence and obedience. "It is a profoundly disappointing evening." Hayes rushed forward, his face pale. "Judge Caldwell, sir, I don't understand. What happened? Why were you brought in?" Harrison slowly turned his head, his piercing gaze locking dead onto Officer Reynolds. Reynolds took a step back, physically shrinking under the weight of the judge's stare. "I was pulled over on my way home from the courthouse," Harrison stated, enunciating every single syllable with lethal precision. "Officer Reynolds informed me that my vehicle was stolen, my state-issued identification was forged, and that my judicial robe—" Harrison paused, pointing a steady, bruised finger at the wet fabric on the counter. "Was a stolen choir gown he referred to as a costume." Hayes whipped his head around to glare at Reynolds, his eyes practically burning holes through the young officer. "Reynolds, tell me you didn't." "Captain, Reynolds stammered, his tough guy facade completely shattering. "He was driving a Benz in Oak Ridge. He didn't look like... he didn't say he was a judge." "I was never given the opportunity to present my credentials beyond the legal requirement of my license and registration, which you immediately declared fraudulent," Harrison countered, his logic a steel trap snapping shut. "You physically assaulted me, pinned me against my own vehicle, placed me in restraints intended to cause physical pain, and mocked my profession. All while your body camera and dash camera were, presumably, recording every single violation of my civil rights." Harrison turned his attention back to the captain. "Captain Hayes, I want a photographer down here, immediately, to document the lacerations and bruising on my wrists. I want the audio and video footage from Officer Reynolds's cruiser and body camera secured and placed into evidence, with a copy sent directly to the Internal Affairs Division and the District Attorney's Office." Harrison took a step closer to Reynolds, who was now visibly shaking. "You told me I was making a mistake, Officer Reynolds," Harrison said softly, the silence in the room amplifying his words. "You told me you were sick of hearing my voice. Well, I assure you, for the next several months of litigation, investigations, and your inevitable termination hearings, my voice is going to be the only thing you hear." The silence in the 12th precinct was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a catastrophic structural collapse. Captain Leonard Hayes stood frozen for a fraction of a second before his training and self-preservation instincts violently kicked in. He knew with absolute certainty that his precinct was currently ground zero for a multi-million-dollar federal civil rights lawsuit, a Department of Justice probe, and a media firestorm that would scorch the earth. "Brody!" Hayes barked, his voice cracking like a whip, shattering the quiet. "Get the precinct photographer up here right now. I want macro lenses. I want color-accurate lighting. I want every single contusion, abrasion, and mark on Judge Caldwell's wrists documented from 5 different angles." Brody scrambled for his radio, his hand still trembling. "Yes, Captain, right away." "And Brody," Hayes continued, his eyes never leaving Reynolds, "lock down the server, isolate the dashcam footage from Cruiser 47 and the body-worn camera data for both Officer Reynolds and Officer Jenkins. Encrypt it and give me the only administrative password. If a single frame of that video gets corrupted, accidentally deleted, or lost in the cloud, I will personally see to it that you are indicted for tampering with evidence." Reynolds's face was completely devoid of color. The arrogant, swaggering street cop who had brutalized a man in the rain just 20 minutes prior had been replaced by a terrified child staring into the abyss of his own making. "Captain!" Reynolds pleaded, taking a shaky step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of supplication. "Captain, please, let's just talk about this in your office. It was a dark road. It was raining heavily. The suspect, the judge, he was driving a vehicle that fit a profile in a high-crime adjacent area. It was a good-faith mistake under stressful conditions. Qualified immunity covers." "Do not insult my intelligence by citing qualified immunity, officer," Harrison Caldwell interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, echoing with a chilling, resonant authority. He didn't yell. He didn't have to. Qualified immunity protects government officials from civil liability only insofar as their conduct does not violate clearly established statutory or constitutional rights of which a reasonable person would have known. A reasonable person knows that a valid, state-issued identification card is not a forgery simply because you harbor deep-seated, racialized assumptions about the wealth of the person handing it to you. Harrison took a slow, deliberate step toward Reynolds, ignoring the sharp pain radiating up his forearms. "Furthermore," Harrison continued, his gaze pinning Reynolds to the floor, "a reasonable officer does not use handcuffs as an instrument of torture because his ego was bruised by a citizen lawfully questioning a detention. You did not make a good-faith mistake. You engaged in a textbook deprivation of rights under color of law in direct violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 242. You weaponized your badge." Captain Hayes stepped between the two men, not to protect Harrison, but to isolate the radioactive liability that Reynolds had become. "Officer Reynolds," Hayes ordered, his tone stripped of any camaraderie. "Hand over your service weapon, now." Reynolds visibly flinched. "Captain, you can't strip me of my weapon before union representation." "I can, and I just did," Hayes roared, the veins pulsing in his neck. "You are hereby relieved of duty, suspended without pay, pending a full internal affairs investigation. Disarm yourself immediately, or I will have you physically subdued and arrested for insubordination and resisting a lawful order from a commanding officer." "Do not test me tonight, Mitchell." With shaking hands, Reynolds unclasped his duty belt. He pulled his heavy Glock from its holster, dropping the magazine and clearing the chamber with a hollow clack before placing the weapon on the booking desk. He unclipped his badge and dropped it next to the gun. The metal shield landed with a dull, pathetic thud. Harrison watched the disarming process with clinical detachment. He then turned his attention to the young rookie, Officer Tyler Jenkins, who was plastered against the far wall, looking like he was about to vomit. "Officer Jenkins," Harrison called out softly. Jenkins jumped, snapping to attention, tears brimming in his eyes. "Yes, Your Honor." "Sir, I didn't. You stood by," Harrison stated factually. "You recognized the discrepancy between the registration and your partner's aggressive narrative. You hesitated when he ordered you to inventory my judicial robe as a costume, but you failed to intervene. The law requires officers to intervene when they witness a fellow officer utilizing excessive force or violating constitutional rights." Jenkins swallowed hard, a tear finally spilling over his eyelashes. "I know, sir. I was scared. He's my training officer. He said—" "I am not interested in what he said," Harrison replied. "I am interested in what you are going to do now. When Internal Affairs pulls you into a windowless room tomorrow morning, you will be faced with a choice. You can hide behind the blue wall of silence. You can claim you didn't hear what he said, or you can uphold the oath you swore when they pinned that badge to your chest. Your career hinges entirely on the exactness of your memory." "I'll tell them everything," Jenkins blurted out, his voice cracking. "I swear to God, Your Honor. I'll write the statement right now. He was out of line. He escalated the situation. You were completely compliant." Reynolds whipped his head around, glaring at his partner with pure venom. "You little rat. You're going to turn on your own partner." "He's not your partner anymore, Mr. Reynolds," Captain Hayes interjected coldly. "He is a witness to a felony." The precinct photographer arrived, a young, nervous civilian employee hauling a heavy camera bag. Under Hayes's strict supervision, the photographer spent 15 minutes documenting Harrison's injuries. The harsh flash of the camera illuminated the deep, purple grooves etched into the judge's wrists, the abrasions on his neck where he had been shoved against the vehicle, and the mud splattered across his ruined suit. When the photography was complete, Captain Hayes awkwardly cleared his throat. "Judge Caldwell, I have already dispatched a tow truck to release your vehicle from the impound lot. It will be brought directly to the front doors of the precinct. I would be honored to personally drive you home." Harrison calmly rolled down his wet sleeves, wincing slightly as the fabric brushed against his battered wrists. He looked at the captain, his expression unreadable. "I appreciate the offer, Captain Hayes, but I will respectfully decline," Harrison said. "I was brought to this facility in the back of a police cruiser as a criminal suspect. I will not leave in the passenger seat of one as a VIP. I have already contacted a private car service. They are waiting outside." Harrison walked over to the booking counter. He reached out and picked up the damp plastic evidence bag containing his judicial robe. He held it carefully, cradling the symbol of his life's work. He turned back to the room one last time. Officer Reynolds was slumped in a hard plastic chair, his face buried in his hands, completely broken. "The fundamental flaw in your policing, Mr. Reynolds," Harrison said softly, the silence of the room carrying his voice to every corner, "is that you believed the badge granted you superiority over the citizens you were sworn to protect. You forgot that the law applies equally to the man in the handcuffs and the man holding the keys. You will have ample time to reflect on that distinction." Without another word, Honorable Harrison Caldwell turned and walked out through the heavy double doors, stepping back out into the freezing rain, holding his dignity and his ruined robe tightly against his chest. The fallout was not immediate. It was a slow, meticulously calculated demolition. Harrison Caldwell did not call a press conference. He did not post angrily on social media. He was a creature of the law, and he utilized the justice system with the devastating precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. 3 days after the incident, a heavily redacted, yet undeniable 45-page complaint was filed in federal court. The plaintiff was Harrison T. Caldwell. The defendants were Mitchell Reynolds, the Oak Ridge Police Department, and the city municipality. The lawsuit did not ask for a monetary settlement. In a move that shocked legal analysts across the state, Harrison explicitly waived his right to compensatory damages. He did not want taxpayer money. Instead, the lawsuit demanded sweeping, mandatory, court-ordered consent decrees. He demanded a complete overhaul of the department's use of force policies, mandatory third-party audits of all traffic stops for racial profiling, and the immediate, permanent decertification of Mitchell Reynolds. The city attempted to keep the matter quiet, offering closed-door settlements and groveling apologies from the mayor. But the truth, much like water, always finds a crack to slip through. A week later, the body camera and dash cam footage somehow leaked to a prominent investigative journalist. Whether it was a disgruntled clerk in the evidence room or a strategic, anonymous drop, the source remained unknown. But the impact was nuclear. The video went viral within hours. Millions of people watched the unedited, raw footage of a distinguished, elderly black man, calmly citing constitutional law, being violently shoved against his own luxury car by a sneering, aggressive young cop. The world heard Reynolds mock the judicial robe, calling it a costume. They heard the violent click of the handcuffs being ratcheted too tight. The public outcry was deafening. Protests erupted outside the 12th precinct. The mayor, facing an unprecedented political crisis, immediately forced the chief of police into early retirement and publicly endorsed every single demand in Caldwell's federal lawsuit. Internal Affairs concluded their investigation in record time, aided immensely by Officer Tyler Jenkins' sworn, heavily detailed affidavit outlining Reynolds' pattern of aggressive, racially biased stops. Jenkins, while reprimanded for failing to intervene sooner, was allowed to keep his job, placed under strict probationary mentorship. Mitchell Reynolds was not so lucky. He was formally terminated from the Oak Ridge Police Department. But losing his job was only the first domino to fall. Because of the overwhelming public pressure and the undeniable video evidence of excessive force and civil rights violations, the district attorney, Thomas Pierce, convened a grand jury. Reynolds was indicted on 3 felony counts: official oppression, aggravated assault, and deprivation of rights under color of law. The arrogant cop who had bragged about throwing a booster into a concrete cell was now facing up to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. 2 months later, the morning air in Oak Ridge Estates was crisp and bright, a stark contrast to the midnight storm of the arrest. Harrison Caldwell stepped out of his front door, dressed in a pristine, perfectly tailored charcoal suit. His wrists had healed, leaving only faint, fading yellow bruises. As he walked down his manicured driveway toward his freshly detailed Mercedes-Benz, he noticed a figure standing awkwardly by his mailbox. It was Richard Farnsworth, the retired surgeon neighbor who had driven past Harrison during the arrest, pretending not to see him. Farnsworth looked pale, holding a small, expensive gift basket. "Harrison," Farnsworth stammered, stepping forward nervously. I just wanted to come by. I saw the news, the video. I am so incredibly sorry. I drove past that night. I didn't realize. I thought." Harrison stopped, looking at his neighbor with cold, penetrating eyes. "You thought exactly what the officer thought, Richard," Harrison said, his voice even, stripped of any warmth. "You saw a black man in handcuffs in our neighborhood, and your immediate assumption was not that your neighbor was in distress, but that the police had finally caught the criminal element you fear so much. You didn't stop because it was easier to believe the stereotype than to defend your neighbor." Farnsworth's face flushed crimson. "Harrison, please, it wasn't like that. I panicked. We are judged not by how we act in the light of day, but by what we do in the dark when we think no one is watching," Harrison replied softly. He walked past Farnsworth, ignoring the gift basket, and opened the door to his car. "Have a good morning, Richard." Harrison drove himself to the courthouse, the commute peaceful and uneventful. He parked in his reserved spot and walked through the heavy marble columns of the judicial building. The security guards at the metal detectors stood a little straighter as he passed, murmuring deeply respectful greetings. The entire building knew what he had done. He hadn't just survived an abusive encounter, he had systematically dismantled the abuser and forced systemic change. He walked into his private chambers. Hanging on the heavy wooden valet stand in the corner of the room was his judicial robe. It had been professionally restored, dry cleaned, and pressed until the heavy black pleats were immaculate. Harrison walked over to it. He reached out, his fingertips tracing the thick, solemn fabric. It was not a costume. It was a heavy, burdensome mantle of responsibility. It represented the fragile promise of justice in a world that was too often unjust. He slipped his arms through the wide bell sleeves, pulling the robe over his shoulders. He zipped it up the front, the sound loud and definitive in the quiet room. He adjusted the collar, smoothing the fabric down his chest. His bailiff knocked lightly on the chamber door, peeking his head inside. "All rise, Your Honor." The bailiff smiled warmly. "The courtroom is packed. Are you ready for the morning docket?" Harrison Caldwell looked at his reflection in the glass of his office window. He saw a man who had been tested by the very system he served, a man who had walked through the fire of prejudice and emerged unbroken. He saw a judge. "I am ready," Harrison said, his voice steady and powerful. He turned and walked through the private door leading to the bench, ready to deliver justice to a world that desperately needed it. The gavel was waiting. Did this story of justice serve to make your blood boil and cheer at the same time? Power unchecked is a danger to us all, but tonight the law fought back. If you loved this dramatic twist of fate and want more intense, real-life-inspired stories of accountability, karma, and the fight for civil rights, make sure